Hi, everybody. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are. It's good morning for me here in Singapore, and it's a pleasure to be here at CMS20. Today, I'm going to speak about the future of seafood in Asia Pacific. Why I'm concentrating on Asia Pacific is this is where 60% of the world's population lives. And we are one of the most fast growing populations in the world, given that China and India are in Asia, and we consume every form, every shape, every texture, and every type of protein in this part of the world. And I'm the CEO and co-founder of Shiok Meats, and we're a cell-based crustacean or seafood and meat company based out in Singapore. So, of course, I'm going to provide a landscape of how seafood is in this part of the world and what are the issues that we're facing, and at the same time, what are the options that we're having and what cell-based seafood can bring to the table. And then also speak a bit about the landscape of cell-based seafood companies in this part of the world, inclusive of cell-based meat companies as well. And then eventually, of course, talk about Shiok Meats and what we're up to and where we're going in the next couple of years. So to start off with, I think, all of us know the issues with conventional meat and seafood industry, but just to throw some light upon some of the issues that we may have never thought of. One thing that we have noticed is there's a lot of YouTube videos and news out there talking about the issues with the conventional meat industry of factory farming of pigs and cows and chickens and so on, but there's not much light thrown upon the issues with the seafood industry. There has been a lot of advancement and changes in the aquaculture and seafood industry, but still there are issues that need to be solved. And given that we are in need of a tremendous amount of protein in the next couple of decades, given that we're going to be 3 billion more in population in the next 30 years, I think it's crucial to understand that we have to have more sources of protein, different sources of protein, and be able to feed the entire world with those protein sources. So to start off with, I guess I've listed the top 7 issues that we see with the conventional meat and seafood industry. Everything from animal cruelty to unethical practices, the whole concept of unsustainability. And I guess we're all here as CEOs or co-founders or people working in the cell-based meat industry, or people are interested in alternative protein and want to understand how our products can be sustainable. There's a study that shows that we're running out of seafood in the oceans in the next 5 years. It's not 10 or 50 years, it's just 5 years. And that is pretty alarming. So that has led to the growth of number of farms for fishes and crustaceans and so on, which is again causing environmental issues, and we are not able to produce enough seafood to feed the entire population. And then there's of course the whole issue of antibiotic overuse, heavy metals and microplastic accumulation in seafood specifically. Lack of traceability. This has come up a lot, specifically in Asia, because there's a lot of import-export here. Coming from a country like Singapore, where we actually import 90% of our food, we only produce 10% in-house. Traceability and access to the right food products, and for us to be able to get the right food supply at the right time is very, very crucial. I think COVID has taught us all that the whole food supply chain or any material supply chain can be disrupted at any time. So it's always better to grow local, eat local. And that's exactly what the Singapore government is also pushing for as well, with their 30 by 30 mandate, where they want to increase the in-house food production to 30% by 2030. I think it's a very ambitious yet achievable plan. And Shiok Meats and the rest of the alternative protein industry fits right into that basket. And the government is very supportive of what all of us are doing. Some of the other issues include slave laborers, the excessive use of energy, water, and land, of course. And I think all of us are bothered about this, which is loss of biodiversity and environmental issues that are being faced because of factory farming and setting up fish farms or shrimp farms around the world. Of course, there have been many stories that have broken out which talk about misrepresentation or mislabeling, where the fish is actually not what the label says, versus some of the meat that was served in the Netherlands a couple of years ago was actually some other type of meat, but it was labeled horse meat, or it was labeled beef, but it was horse meat, and so on. And then, of course, the whole issue of microplastic accumulation in seafood that is eventually ending in our stomachs per se. So given all of these issues, we have seen a huge boom in the cell-based protein industry. Of course, everything from 3D printed proteins to proteins from the air, literally, to beef, to pork, to poultry, to even foie gras, for example, eggs, dairy, and then eventually we are landing up on seafood and even pet food, So all of these are important. Like I mentioned, there's a tremendous need of protein in the next couple of decades. And unless we all work together, it's not going to fulfill the need that's required. So just zeroing in a little bit on cell-based seafood specifically, you can see that there are only a handful of companies. You can literally count it in your fingers. Interestingly, out of those as well, only 2 companies, Avant and Shiok Meats, are in Asia. So we definitely are looking at companies like Blue Nalu and Wild Type and Finless Foods, looking at eventually expanding into Asia as well, and helping us kind of work together and collaborate and see how we can solve this protein need that is required. And at the same time, Avant and Shiok Meats are working specifically on the Asia-Pacific market, where Avant is concentrating on China and Hong Kong and so on, and Shiok Meats is concentrating a lot on Southeast Asia initially, and then expanding a lot more to North and West Asia. Our unique positioning in all of this is that currently we are the only company working on shrimps, which is a part of the crustacean family. And shrimp actually is one of the largest consumed proteins in this part of the world. Not many of us might have realized that, but shrimp is actually used in almost every dish here. Even if it's a fried rice dish that doesn't have shrimp per se in it, shrimp paste is used as a base to make that dish. So you can imagine how much of shrimp is being used. It's used in every form, shape, and size, literally. It is used as shrimp paste. It's used as a flavoring in soups or noodles. It's used as a whole shrimp. It's used as minced shrimp in dumplings and spring rolls. So it's there in every form, shape, and size. We're also working on crab and lobster. And one of the companies that hasn't been listed here is another company in the US that has recently come up called Culture Decadence. They're also working on lobster, and we hope that we can collaborate with them and see how we can further the research on lobster, cell-based lobster meat as well. So just moving forward, one thing why I put this slide up is, some of the most notable companies are listed here, like Memphis and Just, Mission Barn, Super Meat, New Age Meats, and Aleph Farms, and so on. Most of them are in the West, either in US, in Europe, or Israel. Interestingly, in Asia, like I mentioned, we have very, very few companies on the cell-based meat side of things. Singapore, interestingly, has about 4, and if I'm not wrong, 4 cell-based meat companies right now. 3 of them are working on more meat. There's red meat, white meat, and then Shiok is working on seafood. So as you can see, there is a gap, and we are looking at more companies coming up. But I think one thing that all of you might agree with me is, I don't think we need more cell-based meat or seafood companies. What we need is more companies that can support us in terms of giving us, cheaper or inexpensive bioreactors in a faster pace. And then, access to scaffolds and cheaper cell culture media. All of these are issues that we are facing, and they are the challenges that are stopping us from entering the market. So I think more of these ancillary support companies should come up that can help us eventually get the product to market as soon as possible. So I did mention that this part of the world, which is APAC, has 60% of the world's population. But just to understand what the world eats, you have to look at really what they eat. So if you look at a country like Hong Kong, where there are about 7 to 8 million in population, they consume over 144 kilograms of meat and seafood per year per person. So you can do the math and understand the amount of seafood and meats that being consumed in a small country like Hong Kong. And then even in a country like Singapore, which is perhaps the size of San Francisco or New York, consumes about 85 kilograms of meat and seafood per year per person. So these numbers are just alarming when you hear of them. The number of zeros that you can see at the back of these numbers are alarming. And if you put all of the Asian countries together, it's probably a number that is too much for us, and we aren't producing as much. And that's why we're, looking at other countries to, ship over our proteins, which is also not the best. Again, the lack of traceability and misrepresentation is a problem there as well. If you look at a country like India, where the population is 1.2 billion-ish, they consume only about 11 to 20 kilograms of meat and seafood per year per person, but that's 1.2 billion people of eating that. Even though vegetarianism is a bit more popular in India, a lot of youngsters are actually looking at consuming more protein in forms of meat and seafood, but they again have that guilt factor and are bothered about the environment of killing animals and growing them and then consuming their meat. So they are looking more towards the vegan side or the cell-based meat side. So India is an extremely interesting market, especially given that India is one of the youngest countries in the entire world. So about 65% of India's population is younger than 40 years of age. So that means they are the ones who are most interested in the alternative protein industry as well. So now I'm going to jump ship into shrimp and what Shiok Meats does. So first thing, we always get this question, why shrimp? Why not other types of fish? Why not salmon or tuna and so on? Interestingly, shrimp actually has a very impressive nutrition profile. It's very, very low in calories and produces providing only about 84 calories per 85 gram serving. And it actually has very, very less carbs. At the same time, 90% of the calories in shrimp actually come from protein. So as you can see, it's an extremely nutritious protein source. And then there are a lot more benefits in cultivating, or rather, cell-based shrimp and then consuming them as well. But there are issues with the shrimp industry. Again, they are, of course, common with the 7 other issues that I put up before with the conventional meat and seafood industry. But specifically for shrimp, we have seen that 30% of the shrimp products tested are actually misrepresented. They are different types of shrimp. They might be labeled as tiger shrimp, but are other types of shrimp, or they may not be shrimp at all. It's just some other type of seafood. Of course, the use of antibiotics and fungicides is an issue. One thing that I want to throw up on light here is the 1:20 bycatch when you go for wild shrimp. So for every kilogram of every pound of shrimp that you catch in the shrimp trawlers or the nets, there's about 20 kilograms or 20 pounds of bycatch. That is an alarming number. Generally in the fishing industry, it's about 1:3 or 1:5. 1:20 is a lot. So that's actually leading to a lot of loss of biodiversity as well. There's a lot of issues with slave laborers. Products sold in the global markets are peeled by slave laborers that are not paid the right wages or are working in very, unfavorable conditions. Of course, the whole issue of unsustainability and overfishing. One point I want to draw here is a lot of the crabs and the lobsters, specifically among the crustaceans, are not effectively found. So you have to go fish them out of the seas and so on. And we are depleting their population. Shrimp can be farmed effectively, but there are, again, issues like listed here. And then wild shrimp as well digest and accumulate microplastics and heavy metals. So given all of these issues, and Bloomberg actually broke the story a couple of years ago, how shrimps are treated with antibiotics and then smuggled and so on. So it's an industry that's trying to, do as much as they can. But at the same time, there are a lot of issues that come up, and hence Shiok Meats kind of decided to go after shrimp per se in the beginning. To provide some numbers, the global crustacean market is actually projected to grow about 1.4x in revenue to about 150 billion US dollars in the next 5 years. So that's a huge industry that we're going after. And then this 1.4x further goes down the road as you go past the decades. Also, the production of farm shrimp has actually gone up, like I mentioned. Shrimps can be farmed effectively, but there are issues with viral diseases, bacterial diseases. It's very hard to have a pathogen-free shrimp line. So there are farms that are facing issues. Recently, along with COVID around March and April, China actually had to shut down 300 to 400 shrimp farms because all of them were attacked by this viral disease that is very common in shrimp. And that led to them actually literally shutting down their farms. And I still remember Singapore actually stopped having supply of shrimps specifically from China. And then we were looking at other sources for getting our shrimps from. So Asia Pacific actually has the world's largest shrimp producers. And major markets where we export our shrimps are actually into Japan, US, and Europe. A little more into where we stand, as in where crustaceans stand in terms of the market share in terms of value. As you can see, it's about eighth, if I'm not wrong, eighth or ninth in terms of popularity, shares in value, and shares in quantity. You can see that share in value is 23, which is quite high, and the share in quantity is 8.3. So this indicates a very high value and a huge market that everybody wants to be part of. Again, we're looking, like I mentioned, top importers are the US, Europe, Japan, Hong Kong, and Korea, whereas the top exporters or the producers of shrimps are Vietnam, Thailand, India, Indonesia, and Spain. And China imports as well as exports depending on the species and the type of the shrimp that they can and cannot grow. So given that most of the shrimp producers and most of the consumption also happens in Asia Pacific, that's an interesting market for us. But we must remember that within Asia Pacific, each country, each cuisine, each consumer's acceptance and the way they look at alternative protein is very different. So a big part of what Shiok Meats does is to understand different markets in different countries in Asia Pacific, even though Malaysia is just 2 kilometers away from Singapore, the north of Singapore. The cuisine is different. The way people think of alternative protein is different. The way they think about meat and seafood in general and how close it is to their culture and food values is very different between the two countries. So given that, we have to do a lot more surveys and analysis of understanding these markets before we actually enter into these markets. And also the regulators and the regulations are very different between the countries. Each country has its own regulatory framework. We have to work with the regulators there to make sure that our product gets into the market as well. So again, a little bit of stats, because these are some numbers that are really hard to find. So we have managed to, dig it up and speak to the shrimp industry and managed to get these numbers. But the shrimp industry has an impressive CAGR of 8%. And the global shrimp market actually will surpass the 5 billion mark by 2029. And so you can see that it's a high value, high volume product. So it's a huge industry again. And just looking at the Asian crustacean market, 50% of the world's crustaceans actually are produced in China. It used to be a lot more, but like I mentioned, because of the viral diseases and so on, a lot of farms had to shut down. So what happened is when China had to, reduce their production because of the diseases, India, Indonesia, and Vietnam kind of cropped up and they started producing a lot more and exporting a lot more. And then zoning in on Singapore, even though it's a very small country and we're only about 5.5 million in population, it's one of the most popular and the most consumed proteins in this part of the world. Approximately 21 kilograms of seafood is consumed per person per year out of the 85 kilograms that we had mentioned earlier in terms of meat and seafood. And among the 21 kilograms of seafood, about 20 to 30% is crustaceans. So that's a huge number again. So again, just zoning in on Shiok, and that's what I'm going to speak for the next couple of minutes, and then I can take questions. So Shiok Meats is, our mission is to bring delicious, healthy, and sustainable seafood, specifically crustacean meat, so shrimp, crab, lobster, and crayfish, to your table by harvesting it from stem cells and cells instead of animals. We are the first and only Singapore and Southeast Asia's cell-based seafood company currently, and we're the only ones focused on shrimp as well. Shiok actually means delicious or fantastic in Singapore and Malay slang, and it is constantly used for delicious food, so hence the name for the company. So we've listed a couple of features of our shrimp. It also applies to lobster and crab as well. But why we feel our shrimp, or why we think our shrimp is better in every way, is we are adding an alternative production process to the whole food supply chain in terms of shrimps and crustaceans. We're looking at using less energy, water, and land, so sustainability in the environment. Food safety and consumer health is very important for us, so we absolutely use no antibiotics or no harmful chemicals at this point. And then, of course, we are very much bothered about ethics in labor and animal welfare, so no animal cruelty, and well-paid jobs, and no slave laborers as well, even as we grow as a larger industry. The company was founded in August 2018, so a little more than 2 years ago, by Kai and myself. We both are in the center here. We both are stem cell scientists with over 20 years of combined experience in stem cell and cell biology, developmental biology as well. I also have a background in business, and hence decided to kind of start this company in 2018. I was obsessively following the whole cell-based meat industry for a couple of years before starting Shiok, and 2018 was the right time to kind of do that. Of course, we've grown the company ever since. We are actually close to 20 people right now. We have a whole group of extremely skilled and experienced scientists, engineers, and food technologists from various universities around the globe. So we all come together with the passion of food as well as science and engineering. And our mission is to make sure that we get this product to the market in the safest and the most delicious way. And then we have consumers actually wanting to buy more of it in the future. This is something that we put together, of course, based on the infographic that GFI put up for cell-based meat. So we have compared cell-based seafood to green, plants and vegetables grown in greenhouses. So specifically for shrimp, the basal technology is pretty similar, but there are, of course, technicalities and a bit of technology difference. And we have ended up filing patent for this technology. And the key reason for that is we feel that we need to make sure that our technology is able to be licensed in the future, where other cell-based seafood companies or meat companies or food companies are able to, license the tech from us, produce shrimp, crab, lobster, similar to how we do it. And that's the only way we can reach that mass scale production per se. So we believe in a collaborative model. We believe that all of us have to work together to get those numbers and get the mass population to get access to cell-based meats. I'm talking about 10, 20 years, down the line. So we start off with a small sample of shrimp stem cells, and we, of course, expand them in culture, and we grow them in a bioreactor eventually. And it takes only about 4 to 6 weeks for us to get the minced shrimp at this point. We are working on a structured 3D shrimp as well, using hydrogels and so on as scaffolds, and that'll happen in the next couple of months as well. One thing I'd like to mention here is shrimps actually grow in the bottom of the oceans, as you know. So they require lower temperatures, so that means we don't have to do heating, keeps our energy and resources low as well when we're doing our research as well as production eventually. And also another thing that we have found out is that we are able to recycle the media. We're able to use up the spent media in such a way that we don't have to worry about discarding it at this point. We can go back to it. We can use it for growing more cells. And at the same time, our media also has a lot of flavor in it. So we're looking at a second product per se that can actually be used as noodles or soup flavoring or even cup noodle flavoring at this point. So again, this is a bit more, broken up, or a bit more explanation about the technology, which I'm not going to go into. But we have tried different dishes such as dumplings, spring rolls. We are looking at trying tempura soon. We're also in the midst of doing some tastings for lobster and crab in the next couple of months. So we're pretty excited about that. And of course, the whole question about cell culture media comes up. At this point, we are using pharmaceutical grade media that's readily available for most of our research, but a big part of what we're doing within the firm, as well as in collaboration with other companies, is to look at edible nutrient media with growth factors that are acceptable by the food regulators. So as part of that, we are working very hard to make sure that the price is right. It goes down in terms of pricing, as well as the cell culture media is edible and made from ingredients that are already approved by GRAS or by FDA or by SFA, which is the food regulator in Singapore. So in March 2019, 6-7 months after starting the company, we had our first prototype launch and tasting. So the first prototype was a siu mai, or a dumpling, which is an open face dumpling, which is quite common in this part of the world. Generally, it's a shrimp and pork, or a shrimp and beef, or shrimp and chicken mix. So in our case, we used Shiok shrimp, of course, but the pork that we used was corn-based pork. We had Elaine Sue from GFI APAC tasted. We had our investor, Henry from Monday Nissen, tasted as well. And then they were extremely elated and excited. And ever since, we have done a lot more prototyping, like soups and spring rolls. And we're able to see that the shrimp meat survives through steaming versus frying versus putting it in the oven. The taste is intact. At this point, it's minced, so there's no texture per se. But the good thing is it's not a paste, it's actually minced shrimp. And that incorporates very well into a lot of the Asian dishes that we're looking at. So again, when we started off in 2018, it was costing us about $10,000 a kilogram to produce the shrimp meat. We soon after came down to about 5,000 kilograms by swapping some of the pharmaceutical grade ingredients. Our target price for next year is actually 50 kilograms, and this is very much achievable. We just need a bit of time to get there. Right now, we are somewhere in the middle or rather towards the 5,000, but we are at $3,500 per kilogram at this point. This is just by swapping out some of the cell culture media pharmaceutical grade ingredients with hydrolysates and plant-based extracts. We don't use FPS, we use a serum alternative, which is commercially available, but we're trying to swap out even the alternative with a food grade ingredient. So tackling this whole, 80% of our cost goes towards this. So for tackling this, we actually did an exclusive deal, or in the midst of an project with the world's #1 pharma company, to actually look at the first ever cheaper cell culture media for shrimp cells specifically. Then we just announced recently that we are working with Cellculture in Japan that has this amazing proprietary culnet system that is self-sustainable, and different cells of the same animal can produce the growth factors. And hence you don't have to add any external growth factors or external cell culture media. And then of course, in-house, we're looking at testing alternative growth media ingredients that the other companies don't have access to, or that are edible and that already have GRAS certification. Another thing that I'd like to mention is, if you want to start a beef or a chicken company, you can literally, because the cells are readily available. But for shrimp, crab, or lobster, it's literally us starting from scratch. So when Kai and I started, we had to, figure out, how do you take out muscle or fat stem cells from shrimp? How do you grow them? Which temperature? What cell culture media? There's very little literature out there. So a lot of this was done within the firm, and hence we decided to actually patent it so that we can, eventually license the tech. Recently, we closed our Series A, which is great news because this gives us enough funding to move forward and set up our first commercial pilot plant in Singapore. So this is going to be the first of its kind cell-based seafood manufacturing plant in Singapore and this part of the world. So we're looking at eventually, of course, launching with minced shrimp, lobster, and crab meats and dishes, B2B, and then B2B2C eventually. But we're also looking at the 3D products in the next couple of years. Interestingly, we have had a lot of interest in this round. We've had a lot of Asian VC funders. Our lead investor is Aquaspark, who's a sustainable aquaculture focused investment fund from the Netherlands. So we're really looking forward to working with them and kind of collaborating with the aquaculture industry, with the plant-based seafood industry, and seeing how we can all work together towards, supplying for this tremendous protein that we need in the future. We have Seeds Capital, which is the venture arm of Enterprise Singapore funders as well. Then we have Real Tech Fund, Iron Grey, Yellow Dog, Ilshing, and a couple of other, previous seed investors follow on as well. We also have a sustainable packaging company called Toyo Saiken invest in us, and very, very excited because for Kai and me specifically, and all the members in the team, we want to be as much sustainable as possible in the company, everything from packaging to how you produce the meats to what you're producing. So one issue that we've always had is how can we find a stable packaging that can work with frozen meat products, because you can't really pack them in paper or other types of packaging. Generally it's plastic, but we don't want to use plastic. So Toyo Saiken has its own proprietary technology where they look at sustainable packaging for frozen and for long-term storage as well, and their stable packaging. So we're very excited about this whole collaboration with various investors and various companies. In terms of timeline, we're actually looking at launching our product at least in one restaurant in Singapore by 2022, which is not very far away. We're only 2 years away from that. But we're confident that we'll be able to do that with the pricing and also the regulatory approval. One thing I'd like to mention here is the Singapore Food Agency, which is SFA, equivalent of FDA and USDA, actually has a regulatory framework for cell-based meats, and we're very excited to work with them to get the regulatory approval for our products as well. And then for us, we start off with the high-end luxury markets. We're looking at frozen meats being sold to the restaurants, premium restaurants and food suppliers. So we're also looking at the B2B2C market, where these minced products are incorporated in frozen dishes and then sold eventually to consumers on online, through online channels, through food delivery services, or even in supermarkets and grocery stores. So a little bit of light on, again, why Singapore. Like I mentioned, I did speak about this, but we're looking at, being part of the Singapore food story and the mandate of 30 by 30, where they want to increase the local fruit production to 30% by 2030. Singapore has always been considered as a gold standard for food safety and security. And the Food Regulatory Board is very supportive of what we are doing, or very supportive of plant-based, cell-based meats as well, and has actually come up with a framework. For the rest of the countries, we'd like to set up a decentralized system where we're setting up multiple manufacturing plants in the future. But first, we're starting off with Singapore. And then for the rest of the world, we're looking at licensing the technology, like I mentioned. So with that, I'd just like to say that Shiok Meats will soon be in the market in Singapore in the next 2 to 2.5 years. We're very excited about that. Thank you all for your support, and we're looking forward to working together and growing this industry. And I just like to say that we all want to get the world to eat clean, and all of us are doing a great job. I think we just need to bring our products to market as soon as possible. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. We have a couple questions that we'll ask in just a second, but if you do have a question, feel free to put it in the Q&A section, and we'll try to get to it if we can. So we have a question from Marcus that says, shrimp paste. Is shrimp paste one of the first products that you might be bringing to market, since it's a product that's already in demand, and you wouldn't have to solve the texture issue too much?
Right. So in our case, I think that's a very good question, and we have received that a lot. So in our case, the meat that we produce is actually not a paste. It is minced shrimp, which itself is a product, which itself has a lot of market, or rather a lot of consumers wanting to buy minced shrimp. So it's deshelled, deveined, and cut up shrimp. So a lot of people don't like to do that process of deshelling and deveining. So we are actually doing it for them with our process. And then so it's the minced shrimp product. The shrimp paste or the shrimp flavoring powder is actually a byproduct from our Cellculture media, like I mentioned, and that will also be one of the products that we launch initially.
Great. We have a couple more questions coming in more to cost, but before we get to that, I wanted to highlight a couple things that you mentioned that I thought were really great insights. Well, so, I'm always thinking, how can the industry not compete but complement, right? And you mentioned some great things in terms of working on bioreactors, scaffolding, or cell culture media. Can you give us some more? If there's someone in the space that wants to create a new company and doesn't want to just create another cultured meat or, let's say, cultured seafood company, what else can they do? Can you give us more there?
Sure. I think three things that all of us are, having a challenge with is um, the cell culture media, the bioreactors or the equipment, and the scaffolds. I think these three are three big pillars of every cell-based meat company. And honestly, at least for us, we don't want to do it all. We want to collaborate and work with other companies that do it as well. So for the cell culture media, I think we need more research and a lot more understanding of how we can replace these pharmaceutical grade ingredients. Where can we source it from? Let's say we come across a plant extract or a plant ingredient that works great, but we need to figure out if that ingredient is sustainably produced as well. If you're able to have enough supply of it, because imagine if you're having a large scale cell-based meat production facility and you're producing, let's say, 500,000 kilograms a month, you need a lot of media. So you need to make sure there's a constant supply of the ingredients for your media as well. So that's one thing. So we'd love to see more companies coming up in that space with, patented proprietary technologies, or even managing the whole supply chain of ingredients for cell-based meat companies. Second, again, coming back to bioreactors, is right now all of us are using pharmaceutical grade bioreactors or trying to build our own, or we have seen companies come up, startup and other smaller companies come up with innovative bioreactors. But I think that part should move much faster than cell-based meat companies, because we can't move faster unless we have access to these inexpensive and bioreactors that can be produced faster. Because honestly, now if you go to one of these famous bioreactor companies, it takes them somewhere between 9 to 12 months to make a large-scale bioreactor ready and then get delivered and installed. So you have to plan way ahead. But if we can have a faster turnaround, that'll be interesting. Third is, of course, scaffolds, texture, 3D, and so on. The whole concept of scaffolds and texture of red meat versus white meat versus seafood versus even among seafood, among crustaceans versus fish is very different. So one solution doesn't fit all. So we need more companies working on specific meats or specific types of seafood that's out there. And I think one of the other ones that I forgot to mention is when we eventually all start producing and start distributing these products in the market, there should be more companies looking at how to distribute, what kind of dishes should they produce with these meats and so on. I think these are some of the things that we are looking for, and we are always on the lookout for companies that are doing these things. And I think there should be more companies doing this as well.
Great. We have a question from Claire who asks, can you talk a little bit more about the media recycling and byproduct-based shrimp powder? And how close have you managed to get making your process fully circular or zero waste?
Right. So at the R&D level, I would say it's fully circular at this point. I can't speak too much about how we do media recycling or how exactly the flavor is extracted from the media, because it's part of our patent and it's at the provisional stage right now. I can't discuss too much about it. It's confidential. But the technology itself, we have learned a lot from the food industry as to how they extract flavors from liquids or other types of extracts. Talking about the zero waste circular kind of model, we eventually want to be a zero waste model. So that means we have to look at the best filters, best centrifugation processes, the best way to make sure that the effluent or the waste product that we send out is the cleanest. So we actually work with different governments. So right now we're working with the Singapore government to understand what is allowed and what's not allowed. But at the same time, we want to make use of every product or every part of our process. We want to see if we can make a product out of it. It's an additional revenue stream, but at the same time works towards the zero waste kind of concept as well.
Great. And before we get to some of those cost questions, we have a question that's coming in from Kieran, who asks, what open science would Shiok Meats most benefit from in terms of the research? Is there enough knowledge about the structure of texture of the crustaceans for Shiok Meats to mimic?
Sure. So the structure and texture of crustacea, I would say, is fairly less complex compared to red meat, white meat. So we have managed to, do some studies on that, and there have been studies done on the anatomy per se, which gives you access to the texture, how the cells or the layers should be. But one thing that we definitely need help with is access to the cells. Like I mentioned, there's no stem cell bank, or there's no pharma company or stem cell company that's out there selling shrimp, crab, or lobster stem cells. Another issue is, because there's so much unknown in this whole field of crustacean stem cells, a lot of the basic research we are doing it in-house. So if there's some open research in understanding how these cells are immortal inherently, or how can we choose for the best immortal cells, how can we isolate embryonic stem cells, because they are the most best source per se. So these are all questions that are kind of open-ended, and we'd love to see if more universities and researchers can work on the stem cell side of things for crustaceans specifically.
So Stefan asks, can you expand on how you're going to reduce costs from 5K to $5K to $50 per kilogram? Any insight, anything you might be able to share with us?
Sure. So that was part of the one slide that I put up. I didn't want to talk too much about it because a lot of it is confidential. But one is, like I mentioned, we're working with this pharmaceutical company to substantially reduce the price. Second is Integriculture, where their technology really promises that the cell culture media pricing would go down to about $13 to $20 per liter when they're at the medium scale, and then eventually even lower than $3 per liter at the larger scale. But the third that we are in-house, what we're doing and most excited about is the fact that we're able to swap out some of the ingredients with plant hydrolysates and plant extracts that work really well with our cells. Our cells don't seem to die per se, or they don't seem to, dislike the different, hydrolysates that we're using. So that will substantially bring down the price. How we came from the $5,000 per kilogram to the $3,500 per kilogram is literally by swapping out 2 or 3 ingredients with plant extracts. And this is just 2 or 3 ingredients. So when we swap out all of the 10 or 15 ingredients that are there in cell culture media, then we're looking at much more of a price reduction.
Great. And we have an interesting thought from Vince, who mentions cell culture produces carbon, and carbon can be used to be captured by algae. Any thoughts on collaborating with an algae company?
Yes. So can I just say we are in the midst of speaking about this with a couple of companies? Yeah.
That's exciting, and a very multi-purpose connection there. So we have a couple more questions. Some of them are related to costs. Some of them are more general. Doug Grant asks, is there much variation in the media requirements for seafood, poultry, and red meat like there is for different scaffolding requirements?
Oh, definitely, yes. So for one thing, if you think about it, our cells actually don't need FPS. For example, crustaceans at least don't need FPS. We use a serum alternative, but we use it at a different concentration compared to if you grow beef or chicken or pork cells. The other is also in terms of if you're looking at plant-based hydrolysates, you have to think about what the shrimp eats in the ocean or in the farm, and then look at what kind of hydrolysates you can use. For example, we can use algal or seaweed extracts to grow our cells, versus I don't think that might work for beef or chicken, but we haven't tried that yet. It might work, but for us that works. And also it adds on to the flavor per se at the end of the day.
So we have a couple notes from Brian, who mentions that the economic model presented today by Merck earlier said that the current largest scale cell culture methods produce at a cost of $1,100 per kilogram. And then going on to say that it could be a very kind of risky investment to be funded. Now, there's a follow-up that says, with that in mind, what is the anticipated capacity of your pilot plant facility? And again, I know you probably can't answer it directly, but maybe just generalizations.
Sure. At this point, we're looking at a facility initially that would produce a couple of 100 kilograms a month. So again, that's why it's called a pilot commercial facility and not a full-scale facility. Since we are doing this for the first time, we don't want to go big too fast, too big too fast. So we're looking at something that can produce a couple of 100 kilograms a month. But the same facility can extend further into a couple of thousand in terms of increased efficiency of the cells, in terms of looking at perfusion models, in terms of looking at how we can make these cells grow faster and better. So these are some of the things that we're looking into.
Great. And we have a question from Zhongshok, who asks, some people are allergic to shrimp. Can cultured shrimp potentially solve their allergy problems?
Yeah, this is a very, very common question that we get all the time. And we do have an answer to an extent for this. So what we have learned from literature is that most 80% of the population that's allergic to shrimp is allergic to the main protein in the meat itself. So it's one of the most important proteins that forms the structure of the muscle and the tissue. So we are growing that, and there's no way we can take that out. If we take that protein out, basically there's no shrimp meat. So looks like theoretically, these people will still be allergic to the shrimp that we produce. Why? Because we are producing biologically, physically, chemically, to the DNA level, exactly the same shrimp that you eat, but it doesn't come from a dead animal. That's the whole, that's the most exciting thing about cell-based meats. It is still meat. It is not fake or alternative or artificial or synthetic. It's actual meat, but it doesn't come from a dead animal. It doesn't come from a factory farm and so on. But 20% of the population is actually allergic to the shell, a particular protein in the shell. In our case, we don't grow the shell. No part of our process involves the shell. So theoretically, again, we haven't done analysis. We haven't done the testing yet. Theoretically, these people should be able to eat our meats, but we need to do a lot more testing before we can tell this definitively.
So I know that your focus is on the Asian market, where shrimp is very popular, but shrimp wasn't always popular in the US market. And you did mention that in India, and the metric that you said that 60% is a very young country and that 60% is under the age 40, very crazy metric to think about. Do you think that the Indian market will be interested in shrimp, or are they interested in shrimp now?
So interestingly, India, like I mentioned, is the largest one of the largest producers of shrimp and the largest exporters of shrimp, but not as much is consumed within the country. So it's going to be interesting seeing how the population is going to respond to a protein that probably they've never tasted or eaten it very, very less. But again, like I mentioned, the younger population is very excited about the alternative protein industry. They want to try new things. They want to be supportive. I think GFI India is doing a great job. HSI India, which is Humane Society of India, is also doing a great job and kind of understanding the consumer perception, the acceptance, and so on. So I would say we need a bit more time to understand that market before we literally kind of launch there and tell people, hey, there's cell-based shrimp, why don't you come and eat it?
Marcus is asking, what was the thought process around licensing the technology rather than, for example, exporting shrimp to other countries?
Sure. So two main reasons for us. One is, again, like I mentioned, if we want this industry to be as widespread and as accessible to the mass population in the next couple of decades, we all need to work together. It's going to be very hard. I'm very practical about a lot of things. So thinking about it in practicality, if only Shiok Meats will be producing and exporting cell-based shrimp to the entire world, it's going to take us a lot more than a couple of decades. So I'm very, very practical again. So the idea is that we license this tech out to other companies or even other cell-based seafood and meat companies that want to expand their product portfolio in different parts of the world like US and Europe, where they already have access to engineers and scientists and manufacturing engineers and so on, access to equipment, access to cell culture media to an extent. If we can plug in our technology at their existing production facility, or they want to set up another production facility, that's much faster to do and might be easier at that point. The second is, again, looking at the carbon footprint of food that is being flown over or shipped over from the west to the east. It's again, adding to a lot of environmental concerns, and it is truly unsustainable. So that's where we're looking at a very strong, decentralized manufacturing kind of setup in the future for us. We're looking at least 5 manufacturing plants specifically for Shiok Meats in Asia in the next 10 years. That's how we want to move forward with our production.
Great. And we have a question from Tali, but maybe to rephrase it, do you have any data on currently how much of the shrimp consumed is either prepared at home or prepared at food service? Is there any interesting metric there?
Yes, so I didn't put it up on the slides because it's a lot, because each country differs. So in Singapore, a lot of the seafood that's being bought by consumers is via food service or in restaurants, because the culture here is to eat out more than cook at home. But if you look at a country like Malaysia, where there's a lot of home cooking done, or even countries like Indonesia, seafood is mostly bought in supermarkets, and then people use them at home to cook. So it depends on the country, depends on the culture, and depends on whether it's a developing/developed country. So that depends. So like I mentioned, every country is so different in Asia Pacific, and we have to understand the markets before we kind of enter into it. One solution doesn't fit all at all.
Great. We have 2 more questions here. One is a little bit more broad, but I think we should still try to tackle them anyways. Shenoy asks, what kind of cell culture monitoring tools will be needed to monitor cultures? For example, to optimize growth factor utilization and also reduce costs of production. Any insight on that? Maybe potentially tools that are used now?
Sure. I can specifically talk about crustacean cells for sure. And this is something that ties into the previous question, which I forgot to mention, was what open source research is required. So I think I'll answer kind of both together. Like I mentioned, these crustacean stem cells are so new. We have probably been the first ever to isolate shrimp muscle stem cells and keep them in culture for many, many months, having immortal stem cell lines. Because all of the crustacean stem cell research or cell research that's out there is mostly for breeding or understanding diseases. So nobody really looked at muscle and fat tissues and cells. They looked at liver cells or reproductive cells and so on. So one thing that is an issue for us is all of the biochemical and the molecular tools that are out there are not meant for crustacean cells. They're meant for mammalian cells or maybe Drosophila, mouse, rat, and so on. So even stuff like cell counters, live death staining, counting of these cells, staining of these cells, all of it we had to, tighter and figure it out in-house. There is no solution that we can just find, or there's no reagent that we can just go and order and immediately, use it. These cells are extremely small in size, so that is a problem. Problem in the sense there are no molecular tools out there specifically for them. They are suspension, they don't adhere actually. So they're suspension from day one, which is a great advantage for a cell-based seafood company. But at the same time, a lot of the tools that are out there are meant for adherent cells. So we have a lot of learnings from insect cells specifically because they are smaller in size. They are mostly in suspension as well. So we read a lot about insect cells, of course, a lot about fish cells as well. And then we learn from there. But if there's a bit more open research and a bit more understanding about molecular tools, specifically for small size suspension cells, it'll be interesting to work together. Yeah.
Great. And as we close out, I think I want to kind of direct an entrepreneurship question towards you. what has really been the biggest challenge? Maybe a challenge you haven't been able to anticipate, but what has really been the biggest challenge over the last 2 years in this journey?
Okay, let me start. So when we started off, like I mentioned, 2 years back in Singapore, we were the first ever cell-based meat company. And for those who don't know this, Asia has this culture of deep tech or biotech companies being spin-offs from universities or research institutes. But Kai and I pretty much took the plunge and we started an independent company. So we aren't linked to any university. Our IP is our own. We are not licensed from anywhere. It's not part of our previous work. So we literally quit our jobs in a couple of weeks of deciding to start this company. We left everything and we took this plunge with a first angel investment of about $10,000, had this amazing passion and belief in ourselves that we can do this, and absolutely no lab, no shrimp stem cells, no access. We didn't even know whether we could isolate shrimp stem cells. So we literally started off with an idea. So I think we took the plunge, but I think the biggest challenge we had was that people were very, very skeptical. People are still very skeptical because we are not in the market yet. So I understand that. But I think it was more about two Asian women who are scientists who quit their job overnight to start a company with just an idea and no money. So that was the biggest challenge. So, and again, it ties back to the Asian investors where they're a bit more risk averse. They were a bit more risk averse. Why I say that is things have changed in the last couple of years. As you can see, just within 2 years, we have managed to attract a lot more Asian investors in our Series A compared to our seed round. So those were some of the challenges, everything from funding to, you know, being one of the first and so on. And then I think another challenge that we're still facing is, you know, equipment taking a lot of time to get delivered and installed. A lot of it is done in Europe and US. We don't really have as much bioreactor manufacturers in this part of the world other than in China. So yeah, that's an interesting challenge that we're having right now. So setting up the pilot manufacturing facility itself is a challenge, but setting it up in Asia is a bit more of a challenge for a company that's in between biotech and food. So these are some of the challenges that we have faced or are facing.
And definitely a challenge worth taking on. So thank you very much.
Eventually, I think, sorry, but I think eventually it's consumer acceptance and perception at the end of the day. So that's why we're doing a lot more survey and analysis on that part. Like I mentioned, each country is so different that we have to make sure that we understand them before launching the product. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much. That concludes our session for, actually not just session for today. Some of you are joining us on Tuesday already, others it's still Monday. But we will have a recording of this session that we'll be posting live. And you might have noticed some people are raising their hand in the audience. We're going to be transitioning over to the next segment. Sandhya, thank you so much. This has been very insightful. There were actually, I think, 1 or 2 more questions that were in the QA. If you do still have those questions, feel free to put them in the questions for speakers Slack channel, and then the speakers will get back to them as soon as possible. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks. Pleasure being here, and hope you have a good rest of the conference. And yeah, if anybody else has questions, please feel free to reach out to us or just drop me an email, and happy to take it forward, or on Slack as well. Yeah.
Thank you.